The first thing the courtroom heard that morning was laughter, the kind of laughter people let out when they believe something ridiculous is happening right in front of them. It started quietly, just a few chuckles from the back benches, but within seconds it spread across the room like a ripple across water. I remember standing there in my faded blue janitor's uniform, my cleaning cart still parked outside the heavy wooden doors, and realizing that every single person in that courtroom believed I had just made a fool of myself. The reason was simple. I had just told the judge that I would be representing the old man seated beside me. The bailiff looked at me first, eyebrows raised like he thought he had misheard something. The lawyer across the aisle let out a short laugh before covering his mouth, as if he was trying to remain professional but couldn't quite manage it. Even the spectators whispered to each other. A janitor representing someone in court sounded like the start of a bad joke. The judge, a woman in her early 60s named Eleanor Brooks, leaned forward slightly behind the bench and adjusted her glasses as she studied me. Her voice was calm but careful when she spoke. "Ma'am," she said, "are you telling this court that you intend to represent Mr. Harold Bennett today?" I nodded once. "Yes, Your Honor." Another round of laughter broke out. Someone behind me actually said the word unbelievable under their breath. I didn't react. I had spent the last 8 years cleaning the floors of that courthouse. I had heard worse things than laughter. Harold Bennett sat quietly beside me, his hands folded in his lap. He was 79 years old and moved a little slower than he used to, but his eyes were still sharp. He glanced at me for a moment, not with embarrassment, not with doubt, but with a kind of quiet trust that surprised most people when they noticed it. The lawyer representing the other side stood up with the confidence of someone who believed the day would end in an easy victory. His name was Daniel Carter, and he had the polished look of a man who billed clients by the hour and knew exactly how impressive he appeared while doing it. "Your Honor," he said, struggling to keep the amusement out of his voice, with respect. "I believe the court requires licensed counsel to represent parties in a civil property dispute." The room went quiet again as the judge turned her attention back to me. "Ma'am," she said carefully, "do you have legal credentials?" I placed my old leather bag on the table in front of me. The bag looked out of place beside the stacks of neatly organized folders belonging to Mr. Carter. Mine was worn around the edges, the kind of bag someone might carry for decades without replacing. "I'm not asking the court to appoint me as counsel," I said calmly. "Mr. Bennett has chosen to let me speak on his behalf." More murmurs filled the room. I could feel the weight of every eye staring at my uniform. It still smelled faintly of the lemon cleaner I had used earlier that morning in the hallway outside courtroom 3. Someone whispered janitor again, like it was the punchline of a story. The truth was that most of the people in that room had seen me before, though they had never really looked at me. I was the woman pushing the cleaning cart down the marble corridors after hours. I was the one mopping the floors near the elevators while lawyers walked past talking about million-dollar settlements. Invisible, that's what people like me usually are in buildings like that. Invisible until we do something unexpected. Judge Brooks rested her hands on the bench and studied Harold Bennett for a moment. "Mr. Bennett," she said, "are you aware of the situation here today?" Harold nodded slowly. "Yes, Your Honor," he replied in a steady voice. "And I trust Margaret Whitmore to speak for me." Hearing my full name made a few people turn their heads again. They had probably never wondered what my name was before. Mr. Carter sighed and spread his hands as if the entire morning had just become an inconvenience. "Your Honor, this case concerns the ownership of a residential property located on the north side of Chicago," he said. "My clients, Mr. Bennett's own son and daughter-in-law, have filed the claim because they believe Mr. Bennett is no longer capable of managing the property himself." That part was true, at least in the way lawyers sometimes present truth. Harold's son had filed the lawsuit 3 months earlier, arguing that his father should move out of the house he had lived in for 42 years. They said the neighborhood had become too expensive for him to manage alone. They said selling the house would allow him to move into a comfortable senior living community somewhere outside the city. What they didn't say was that the house had recently doubled in value. I had heard enough conversations in courthouse hallways to recognize a pattern when I saw one. Judge Brooks looked back at me again, and for a moment I thought she might end the whole thing right there. Instead she sighed quietly and said, "The court will allow Mr. Bennett to proceed as he chooses. However, I expect respectful conduct from everyone involved." Mr. Carter smiled the way someone smiles when they are certain they have already won. The spectators leaned forward in their seats. The laughter had faded now, but the disbelief remained. I opened the old leather bag and took out a thin folder, placing it carefully on the table. My hands were steady, even though I could feel the tension building around us. Somewhere behind me someone whispered, "This is going to be interesting." Maybe they meant it as entertainment. Maybe they thought the janitor would stumble over legal terms or forget what she was supposed to say. But as I stood there beside Harold Bennett, looking across the courtroom at the people who had laughed only minutes earlier, I realized something simple. They were all watching now. And that was exactly what I needed. The courtroom was quieter now, but the silence carried a different kind of tension. A few minutes earlier people had been laughing, whispering behind their hands at the sight of a janitor standing beside an old man in a property dispute. Now those same people were leaning forward in their seats, curious to see how long the strange arrangement would last. Daniel Carter adjusted the cuff of his suit and walked confidently toward the center of the room. His polished shoes echoed softly against the floor that I had cleaned earlier that morning. He placed a stack of documents on the table and looked toward Judge Eleanor Brooks with the calm expression of someone who had presented the same argument many times before. "Your Honor," he began, "this case is straightforward. My clients, Thomas Bennett and Clara Bennett, are requesting legal authority to manage the residential property owned by Mr. Harold Bennett. Their concern is simple. Mr. Bennett is elderly, he lives alone, and he is no longer capable of handling the financial responsibilities associated with maintaining the property." He paused for a moment as if allowing the logic of his statement to settle in the room. Several people nodded quietly. On the surface it sounded reasonable. Carter continued speaking with the smooth rhythm of a practiced attorney. He explained that the property taxes had increased over the last few years. He explained that the home required maintenance that Harold could not realistically perform on his own. He described a plan in which the house would be sold and the proceeds would be used to place Harold in a comfortable retirement community located nearly 80 miles outside Chicago. The words sounded polite, even considerate, but I could see the slight tightening in Harold's shoulders beside me. He had lived in that house for more than 4 decades. It was where he had raised his son. It was where his wife had planted the maple tree that still stood in the front yard. A house is not just a financial asset when you have spent that many years inside it. Carter turned his attention toward me briefly, the corners of his mouth lifting in a restrained smile that suggested he still believed the entire situation was temporary entertainment. "Your Honor," he said, "the opposing side has chosen not to retain professional counsel. Instead they have selected assistance of a different kind." A quiet ripple of laughter moved through the benches again. I did not look up from the folder in front of me. I had heard worse things while scrubbing courthouse staircases late at night. Judge Brooks raised her hands slightly and the room settled again. "Proceed with the facts, Mr. Carter," she said calmly. Carter nodded and called his first witness. Clara Bennett stood from her seat and walked toward the stand with controlled elegance. She wore a pale gray blazer and carried herself with the confidence of someone who believed the outcome of the hearing had already been decided. When she took the oath and sat down, she glanced briefly toward Harold without meeting his eyes. Carter began with gentle questions. He asked Clara how long she had been married to Harold's son. She answered clearly that she had been part of the family for nearly 12 years. He asked how often she visited Harold's home. She explained that she and her husband tried to check on him regularly because they were concerned about his well-being. She spoke about unpaid bills that she claimed to have discovered during a visit the previous winter. She described the increasing cost of maintaining the house, mentioning roof repairs, heating bills during Chicago winters, and the growing property taxes in the neighborhood. Her tone was patient, almost sympathetic, as though she was explaining a difficult situation that no one wanted to face. Carter nodded at each answer, guiding her through the narrative he wanted the court to hear. To anyone listening casually, the story sounded convincing. A caring family trying to protect an aging father from responsibilities that had become too much for him. When Carter finished his questions, he stepped back from the stand with visible satisfaction. "Your witness," he said lightly, glancing in my direction. The room waited. I could feel dozens of eyes watching the janitor who had somehow become part of the morning's proceedings. I stood slowly and picked up a single sheet of paper from my folder. The paper itself was ordinary. Nothing about it would have impressed anyone in that courtroom. As I walked toward the stand, I noticed how quiet the room had become again. The laughter from earlier had faded into curiosity. Clara Bennett looked at me with polite patience, the kind of expression people sometimes use when they expect a child to ask a simple question. I stopped a few feet from the witness stand and spoke calmly. "Mrs. Bennett," I said, "you mentioned that you discovered unpaid bills at Mr. Bennett's home last winter. Can you tell the court exactly which bills you are referring to?" Clara answered without hesitation. She listed property taxes and heating expenses that she claimed Harold had forgotten to pay on time. Her voice remained steady. I nodded slowly as if I were simply trying to understand. "And when you discovered these bills," I asked, "did you notify Mr. Bennett before contacting an attorney?" Clara paused for a moment before responding. "We tried to talk to him," she said. "But he refused to listen to reason." I made a small note on the paper in my hand. The action seemed insignificant, but I noticed Carter shifting his weight slightly where he stood. "One more question," I continued quietly. "When you say that Mr. Bennett refused to listen to reason, are you referring to the conversation that took place on February 14th of this year?" Clara blinked once, the first sign of uncertainty that had appeared since she took the stand. "I believe so," she said. "Yes, that sounds correct." I nodded again and looked toward the judge. "Thank you, Mrs. Bennett," I said. That was the conversation I was hoping to discuss. A faint murmur moved through the courtroom as people sensed something subtle changing in the direction of the hearing. I returned to the table beside Harold and placed the sheet of paper back into the folder. Harold looked at me briefly with the same quiet trust he had shown earlier. Across the room, Daniel Carter no longer appeared amused. His expression had shifted into something more cautious, as if he had just realized that the janitor standing across from him might not be asking random questions after all. I noticed the moment Daniel Carter stopped smiling. It was subtle, the kind of change most people would miss, but I had spent years watching people inside that courthouse. When you clean offices after hours, you learn how to read expressions the way other people read newspapers. Carter no longer looked amused. He looked cautious. Clara Bennett remained seated at the witness stand, but the confident rhythm of her earlier answers had faded. She adjusted the sleeve of her blazer and glanced briefly toward Carter as if expecting him to interrupt. He did not. Judge Eleanor Brooks leaned slightly forward behind the bench. "Mrs. Bennett," she said calmly, "please answer the questions as clearly as possible." Clara nodded. "Of course, Your Honor." I stepped back toward the stand again, holding the same sheet of paper I had carried earlier. It still looked unimpressive. Just a single piece of paper from an old folder carried by a courthouse janitor. But paper can change a room if the words on it are chosen carefully. "Mrs. Bennett," I said quietly, "you testified that you attempted to help Mr. Bennett manage his bills during the winter." "Yes," she replied immediately. "My husband and I were worried about him. And that concern is what led you to file this legal request asking the court to remove his authority over the house." "Yes," Clara said again. Her voice remained steady, but the pause before the word was slightly longer. "This time." I nodded slowly as though I was following her reasoning step by step. "Let us talk about the conversation you mentioned earlier," I said. "The one that took place on February 14th. Clara hesitated again. "All right. You said Mr. Bennett refused to listen to reason that day." "Yes." I glanced briefly toward Harold Bennett beside me. He sat quietly with his hands resting on the table, listening to every word. I turned back to Clara. "Do you remember what time that conversation happened?" She frowned slightly. "I am not sure of the exact time." "Was it in the afternoon?" I asked. "Perhaps around 3 o'clock." Clara nodded slowly. "Yes." That sounds right. I made another small mark on the paper. The courtroom had grown so quiet that the faint scratch of the pen seemed louder than it should have been. And you visited the house that day with your husband, Thomas Bennett? Yes. You arrived together? Yes. You left together? Clara shifted slightly in the chair. Yes. Another quiet murmur moved through the spectators. People had begun leaning forward in their seats again, trying to understand why a janitor was asking questions that sounded simple but somehow did not feel accidental. Daniel Carter cleared his throat lightly. Your Honor, he said, I fail to see the relevance of the timeline here. Judge Brooks looked toward him but did not immediately agree. Let us allow the witness to finish answering, she said. Carter nodded reluctantly and stepped back again. I returned my attention to Clara. Mrs. Bennett, do you recall signing any documents during that visit on February 14th? Clara blinked again. Documents? Yes, I said gently. Any paperwork related to the house? She hesitated longer this time. I do not remember signing anything. I tilted my head slightly as if considering her answer. You are certain about that? Yes. The word came out more quickly now, as if she wanted the question to disappear. I placed the sheet of paper back into the folder and slowly removed a second document. This one looked older. The edges were slightly worn from being folded and unfolded several times. I held it carefully between my fingers before turning toward the judge. Your Honor, I said calmly, may I approach the bench? Judge Brooks nodded. I walked forward and placed the document where she could see it. She adjusted her glasses again and studied the page for several seconds. Her expression changed very slightly. Not dramatically, just enough to suggest that the paper contained something she had not expected. Where did you obtain this document? She asked. It was mailed to Mr. Bennett 2 weeks after the visit Mrs. Bennett just described, I replied. The room had become completely silent now. Even the spectators who had laughed earlier seemed aware that something important had entered the conversation. Judge Brooks turned the paper toward Clara. Mrs. Bennett, she said slowly, is this your signature? Clara leaned forward. The confidence that had filled her earlier testimony was no longer present. It looks similar, she said carefully. But I would have to examine it more closely. I stepped back from the bench and returned to my place beside Harold. Daniel Carter moved quickly to the front of the room now, his voice controlled but noticeably firmer than before. Your Honor, he said, would request that any document presented be verified before drawing conclusions. Of course, Judge Brooks replied. That is precisely what the court will do. She turned toward Clara again. Mrs. Bennett, please answer the question directly. Did you sign this document on February 14th at Mr. Bennett's home? Clara's eyes moved briefly toward Carter again. For the first time since the hearing had begun, she did not answer immediately. The pause stretched across the room. The spectators could feel it. Daniel Carter could feel it. Even Harold Bennett beside me shifted slightly in his chair. Finally Clara spoke again, but the certainty in her voice had changed. I might have signed something, she said slowly. But it was only part of helping him organize his bills. I nodded once, quietly. Thank you, I said. I returned the document to the folder and closed it carefully. Across the room Daniel Carter no longer looked confident. His attention remained fixed on the folder in my hands as if he had just realized that the janitor standing in front of him had brought more than questions into that courtroom. The silence that followed Clara Bennett's answer felt heavier than the laughter that had filled the courtroom earlier that morning. People who had once been amused were now watching with careful attention. A single sheet of paper had managed to change the mood of an entire room. Daniel Carter stepped forward again, but the confident rhythm that had guided him earlier was gone. He spoke with deliberate control now. Your Honor, he said, the witness has already explained that any document signed during that visit was simply part of assisting Mr. Bennett with routine financial matters. There is nothing unusual about family members helping an elderly parent organize bills. Judge Eleanor Brooks did not immediately respond. She continued looking at the document in front of her, turning it slightly beneath the courtroom lights as if examining the details printed across the page. Finally she looked toward Clara Bennett again. "Mrs. Bennett," the judge said calmly, "this document appears to authorize the transfer of administrative authority over Mr. Bennett's property. That is not the same as organizing bills." Clara shifted in her seat again. Her posture had changed since the hearing began. The calm confidence she displayed earlier had slowly been replaced by careful hesitation. "Your Honor," she replied, "we believed it was necessary to help him manage things properly." I stood quietly beside Harold Bennett while the exchange unfolded. The folder rested under my hand on the table, its worn edges drawing occasional glances from people who were now trying to understand how much information might still be inside it. Harold leaned slightly closer to me and whispered just loud enough for me to hear. "You are doing fine," he said softly. I nodded once but kept my eyes on the front of the courtroom. Daniel Carter turned toward Clara again. "Mrs. Bennett," he said, trying to regain control of the situation, "please explain to the court why you believed that document was necessary." Clara straightened slightly in the chair and took a breath before answering. "Mr. Bennett has been forgetting important responsibilities," she said. "Property taxes, insurance payments, maintenance issues around the house. My husband and I believed that giving us the authority to handle those matters would protect him." Her voice sounded steadier now as if repeating a prepared explanation. Carter nodded and turned toward the judge again. "Your Honor, this is precisely the kind of family support that responsible relatives provide. My clients were attempting to prevent financial trouble for Mr. Bennett." Judge Brooks rested her hands together and looked toward me. "Mrs. Whitmore," she said, "do you have additional questions for the witness?" I stepped forward slowly again. The quiet inside the courtroom deepened. People had stopped thinking of me as a janitor who wandered into the wrong room. They were listening now. "Yes, Your Honor," I said. I looked toward Clara Bennett again. "Mrs. Bennett, you mentioned that the purpose of the document was to protect Mr. Bennett from financial trouble." "Yes," she replied. "Let us discuss the property taxes you mentioned earlier," I said. Clara nodded cautiously. "You testified that Mr. Bennett had forgotten to pay them on time." "That is correct." I opened the folder again and removed a second document, placing it gently on the table before turning it so the judge could see it clearly. "Your Honor," I said, "this is the property tax receipt for Mr. Bennett's home dated January 10th of this year." Judge Brooks leaned forward slightly. "And?" I continued calmly. "The taxes were paid in full. 35 days before the February 14th visit Mrs. Bennett described." The quiet in the room sharpened again. Daniel Carter looked toward Clara quickly. Clara's expression tightened slightly as she looked at the paper. "I am not aware of that receipt," she said carefully. I nodded once. "It was mailed directly from the county office to Mr. Bennett's address." Judge Brooks studied the document for several seconds before placing it beside the earlier paper on the bench. "Mrs. Bennett," the judge said slowly, "did you verify the financial situation before preparing the document that would transfer authority over this property?" Clara hesitated again. The answer she had repeated earlier now seemed less certain. "We believed there were unpaid obligations," she said. I kept my voice calm. "Mrs. Bennett, when you and your husband arrived at the house on February 14th, did you bring the document with you already prepared?" Clara looked briefly toward Carter again before answering. "Yes." "And you asked Mr. Bennett to sign it during that visit?" "Yes." "Did you explain that the document would allow you to control the property itself?" Clara did not answer immediately. The silence stretched long enough that several spectators shifted in their seats. Finally she said, "We told him it would help manage things." I closed the folder again and rested my hand on top of it. "Thank you," I said quietly. I stepped back beside Harold Bennett once more. Daniel Carter remained standing near the witness stand, but his earlier confidence had faded into visible concern. The courtroom was no longer watching a simple property dispute. People were beginning to understand that the questions asked by a courthouse janitor were slowly revealing a story that had not been presented when the hearing began. Judge Brooks leaned back in her chair and looked across the room again. Mr. Carter, she said calmly, the court would like to examine the circumstances under which this document was signed. Please continue. And for the first time since the hearing started that morning, Daniel Carter appeared uncertain about what the next step should be. Daniel Carter remained standing for a moment as if he was carefully choosing his next words. The confident attorney who had walked into the courtroom earlier that morning now looked like someone trying to regain control of a conversation that had quietly slipped away from him. He adjusted the papers on the table and looked toward Judge Eleanor Brooks with a composed expression that did not quite hide the tension beneath it. Your Honor, he said slowly, my clients acted in good faith. They believed Mr. Bennett required assistance. Any misunderstanding about the document should not be interpreted as malicious intent. Judge Brooks rested her hands together and looked toward Clara Bennett again. The judge had spent decades listening to testimony inside that room, and she had learned that the smallest details often revealed the most important truths. Mrs. Bennett, she said calmly, the court would like to understand exactly how the document was presented to Mr. Bennett on February 14th. Clara inhaled slowly and nodded. We visited him that afternoon, she said. My husband and I were worried about the condition of the house and his finances. We explained that the document would help us organize things. I listened quietly beside Harold Bennett while Clara spoke. Her words sounded careful now, each sentence measured as though she was walking across thin ice. Daniel Carter stood close enough to the witness stand to guide the direction of her answers if necessary. But the room had shifted again. People were no longer focused on the lawyer. They were watching the details unfold. Judge Brooks leaned slightly forward. Did you read the document to Mr. Bennett before he signed it? She asked. Clara hesitated. The pause was brief but noticeable. We summarized it, she said. I stepped forward again before the silence faded. Your Honor, I said respectfully, may I ask the witness a few additional questions regarding that visit? Judge Brooks nodded once. You may proceed. I turned toward Clara Bennett again. Mrs. Bennett, I said quietly, when you arrived at the house that afternoon, did you bring the document with you already printed? Yes, she replied. It was prepared earlier. Prepared by whom? I asked. She glanced briefly toward Daniel Carter. By an attorney. Was Mr. Bennett aware that an attorney had prepared a document transferring authority over his home before you arrived? Clara's expression tightened slightly. I do not know what he expected. I nodded slowly. Let us talk about the moment he signed the document. The courtroom had grown completely silent again. Even the faint movement of chairs had stopped. Clara looked toward the judge before answering. We explained that it would allow us to help him manage the property, she said. And he agreed. I opened the folder again and removed another paper. This one was smaller than the earlier documents, but it carried a familiar heading printed across the top. I placed it gently on the table where the judge could see it. Your Honor, I said calmly, this is a certified copy of the document Mrs. Bennett brought to Mr. Bennett's home on February 14th. Judge Brooks examined the page carefully. The room waited. After several seconds she looked up again. Mrs. Bennett, she said, this document contains language authorizing the immediate sale of the property if the new administrators deem it financially necessary. Clara shifted again in the witness chair. It was meant to protect him, she repeated. I spoke again before the explanation could settle. Mrs. Bennett, did you tell Mr. Bennett that signing the document would allow the house to be sold? Clara's eyes moved across the courtroom briefly as if searching for something familiar. We explained that we would manage things responsibly, she said. I kept my voice calm and steady. That was not my question. Another long pause followed. Daniel Carter stepped forward slightly. Your Honor, he said carefully, the witness has already stated that the intention was to help Mr. Bennett. Judge Brooks raised one hand gently without looking at him. The witness will answer the question directly, she said. Clara lowered her eyes toward the document again. No, she said quietly. The single word moved across the courtroom like a sudden draft of cold air. Several spectators exchanged glances. Harold Bennett remained still beside me, but I could see the faint tightening of his hands on the table. I continued speaking in the same calm tone. Did you inform Mr. Bennett that the document allowed you to place the property on the market immediately after obtaining authority? Clara did not answer at first. The silence stretched until Judge Brooks spoke again. Mrs. Bennett. Clara looked toward the judge. No, she repeated more clearly this time. I closed the folder again and placed both hands on the table. Across the room, Daniel Carter's expression had changed once more. He was no longer trying to dismiss the questions as harmless confusion. He was studying the folder now with the careful attention of someone who understood that every page inside it might reshape the entire case. Judge Brooks leaned back in her chair and looked across the courtroom again. The court would like to hear from Mr. Bennett next, she said. And as Harold slowly rose from his seat beside me, the room realized that the story they thought they understood at the beginning of the hearing was only beginning to reveal itself. Harold Bennett stood slowly from his chair beside me, steadying himself with one hand on the edge of the table. The courtroom watched him with the quiet attention that people give to someone who has lived long enough to carry an entire history in the way they move. He walked toward the witness stand at an unhurried pace, the sound of his shoes soft against the polished floor that reflected the overhead lights. The bailiff administered the oath, and Harold sat down carefully, folding his hands together the way he had done earlier at the table. Judge Eleanor Brooks studied him for a moment before speaking. Mr. Bennett, she said gently, please tell the court about the visit on February 14th. Harold nodded slowly. His voice, when he spoke, carried the calm tone of someone who had spent years choosing words carefully. My son Thomas and his wife Clara came by that afternoon, he said. They said they were worried about me. Across the room, Clara Bennett sat very still, her expression composed but tight around the edges. Daniel Carter remained beside her, watching every detail with focused attention. Harold continued speaking. They said the house was becoming too much responsibility. Taxes, repairs, things like that. I told them I was managing fine. He paused briefly, as if recalling the moment more clearly. But they insisted they could help organize things. Judge Brooks nodded slightly. Did they show you the document that has been discussed here today? Harold looked down at his hands for a moment before answering. They showed me several papers, he said. Most of it sounded like routine paperwork. Clara explained that it would allow them to assist with bills and property issues. I stood quietly beside the table while he spoke. The room had grown completely silent again, the kind of silence that settles when everyone understands the story is reaching an important point. Judge Brooks asked the next question carefully. Did you understand that signing the document could allow the property to be sold? Harold lifted his head slowly. No, Your Honor, he said simply. The answer carried across the courtroom without hesitation. A faint murmur moved through the spectators again. Harold continued speaking before anyone else could interrupt. I would never have signed anything like that. That house is my home. My wife and I bought it when our son was still in grade school. We lived there our whole lives. Daniel Carter stepped forward slightly. Mr. Bennett, he said with a measured tone, is it possible that you misunderstood the explanation provided by your family? Harold looked toward him calmly. I may be 79 years old, he said, but I still know the difference between paying bills and giving away my house. The quiet statement seemed to settle heavily in the room. Carter adjusted his stance and glanced briefly toward Clara before continuing. Do you recall exactly how the document was presented to you? Harold nodded slowly. They asked me to sign quickly because they said it would make things easier. I trusted them. The final sentence carried a quiet weight that no one in the courtroom could ignore. Judge Brooks folded her hands again and studied the witness carefully. Mr. Bennett, after signing the document, did you receive a copy? Harold shook his head. No. They said they would handle the paperwork and send me anything I needed later. I could see several people in the audience exchanging glances again. The story that had sounded like a simple act of family assistance now felt very different when told from the witness stand. Judge Brooks turned slightly toward me. Mrs. Whitmore, she said, do you have questions for Mr. Bennett? I stepped forward again. Just a few, Your Honor. I looked toward Harold and spoke gently. Mr. Bennett, when did you first realize the document might not be what you believed it was? Harold leaned back slightly in the chair. About 2 weeks later, he said. A letter arrived in the mail confirming a change in property authority. I nodded slowly. And what did you do when you read that letter? Harold gave a small tired smile. I went down to the courthouse the next morning to ask questions. Several spectators shifted again when they heard that. I continued speaking quietly. Is that when we first met? Harold nodded. You were cleaning the hallway outside the records office, he said. I asked if you knew where I could get help understanding the paperwork. A few people in the room turned toward me again, suddenly interested in the small detail. I kept my voice calm. And what did I tell you? Harold looked toward the judge briefly before answering. You said the first step was to read everything carefully before trusting anyone's explanation. Judge Brooks watched the exchange with thoughtful attention. Daniel Carter remained silent now, his earlier confidence replaced by careful observation. The courtroom no longer saw a simple disagreement between family members. They were beginning to understand that the janitor standing beside the defense table had been part of the story long before the hearing ever began. Harold finished his testimony with one final statement that echoed quietly across the room. I trusted my family, he said. But I also trusted the person who helped me understand what those papers really meant. When he stepped down from the witness stand and returned to the table beside me, the room remained completely still. The laughter that had greeted us earlier that morning had disappeared entirely. In its place there was something else now. Respect, curiosity, and the growing realization that the quiet woman in a janitor's uniform might know far more about the case than anyone had expected when the courtroom doors first opened that day. The courtroom did not return to its earlier noise after Harold Bennett finished speaking. The silence stayed, heavier now, filled with a quiet understanding that the case was no longer what it first appeared to be. Harold settled back into the chair beside me, folding his hands again the same way he had done throughout the morning. I could feel dozens of eyes moving between the two of us, studying the janitor and the old man as though trying to solve a puzzle they had underestimated at the beginning of the day. Judge Eleanor Brooks allowed the silence to linger for a moment before speaking. Mr. Carter, she said calmly, you may proceed with any questions you wish to ask the witness or present additional argument. Daniel Carter stepped forward slowly, but the polished confidence that had defined him earlier had faded into careful restraint. He looked toward Harold for a moment, then toward me, then back toward the judge. Your Honor, he said, my clients maintain that their actions were motivated by concern for Mr. Bennett's well-being. There may have been confusion about the details of the document, but that does not change the fact that Mr. Bennett is elderly and managing a valuable property alone. Judge Brooks listened without interrupting. Carter continued speaking with measured control. The property in question has increased significantly in value. Maintaining it requires financial and administrative responsibilities that may become difficult for someone living without assistance. He paused briefly, then added, my client simply wanted to protect their father. Clara Bennett nodded faintly beside him, though the confidence she displayed earlier had not returned. The courtroom waited to see what would happen next. Judge Brooks turned her attention toward me again. Mrs. Whitmore, she said, you have presented several documents already. Does the defense wish to introduce additional information regarding the circumstances surrounding this document? I stood slowly. The folder resting on the table had become the quiet center of the entire room. People were watching it now with the same attention they might give to evidence in a much larger trial. Yes, Your Honor, I said calmly. I opened the worn leather folder again and removed a thin envelope. The paper inside it was slightly creased, the kind of envelope that had clearly traveled through the mail rather than being prepared inside a law office. I walked forward and placed it on the bench in front of Judge Brooks. This letter arrived at Mr. Bennett's home 2 weeks after the document was signed, I explained. Judge Brooks opened the envelope and read silently for several seconds. Her expression remained composed, but the room sensed another shift taking place. Mrs. Bennett, the judge said. Slowly, looking toward Clara again, this letter appears to be a confirmation from a real estate firm acknowledging preliminary preparations to list the property for sale. Clara's shoulders stiffened slightly. Daniel Carter stepped forward immediately. Your Honor, he said, a preliminary inquiry does not mean the property would necessarily be sold. I spoke again before the explanation could settle. Your Honor, the letter was sent 4 days after the document granting authority was filed with the county office. Judge Brooks looked at the date printed near the top of the page. 4 days, she repeated quietly. The spectators exchanged another wave of glances. Carter cleared his throat again. That does not change the intention of the document, he said. My clients believe the house might need to be sold in the future if expenses became unmanageable. I nodded slightly, then reached into the folder once more. There is one more detail the court may find helpful, I said. This time I removed a printed statement from the county property records office. I placed it beside the earlier documents on the bench. Judge Brooks examined the page carefully. Her eyebrows lifted slightly as she read the information near the center of the document. According to this record, she said slowly, the property taxes on Mr. Bennett's home have been paid in full for the next 2 years. The statement settled over the room like a quiet conclusion forming piece by piece. Daniel Carter's posture stiffened slightly as he absorbed the information. Clara Bennett did not speak. I continued calmly. The payments were made through an automatic arrangement established nearly 6 years ago. Judge Brooks leaned back slightly in her chair. Meaning, she said, there were no immediate financial pressures requiring the property to be sold. That is correct, Your Honor, I replied. A quiet murmur moved across the spectators again. The narrative that had been presented at the beginning of the hearing now seemed to be unraveling slowly under the weight of small but undeniable details. Daniel Carter finally stepped forward again, but his voice had lost the confident tone it carried earlier. Your Honor, he said, there may still be concerns about Mr. Bennett's ability to manage the property long term. Judge Brooks folded her hands together again and looked across the courtroom. Perhaps, she said calmly. Then she looked directly at Clara Bennett. But this court is becoming increasingly interested in understanding why the authority to sell the property was prepared before any actual financial problem existed. Clara lowered her gaze briefly. The room remained silent again. People were no longer watching a janitor and an old man struggling through a legal argument. They were watching a careful sequence of facts reshape the entire story. I closed the folder quietly and placed my hand on top of it. The laughter from earlier that morning now felt like something that had happened in a completely different place. And as the courtroom waited for the next response, it was clear that the most surprising part of the case had not yet been spoken aloud. The courtroom had become so quiet that even the soft rustle of paper seemed louder than it should have been. Earlier that morning people had laughed when I first stood beside Harold Bennett, but now no one was laughing. Instead they were watching every movement, every document placed on the bench, every expression that crossed the faces of the people involved. Judge Eleanor Brooks sat still behind the bench, her eyes moving slowly from one piece of evidence to another. The letter from the real estate firm remained open in front of her, beside the property tax record and the authorization document that had started the entire case. Daniel Carter stood beside the witness table with his hands resting lightly on the surface, but his posture had changed. The confident attorney who had walked into the courtroom expecting a simple victory now looked like a man carefully calculating how much control he still had over the situation. Clara Bennett sat beside him, her shoulders stiff and her gaze lowered toward the floor. For several seconds no one spoke. Finally Judge Brooks broke the silence. Mrs. Bennett, she said calmly, the documents presented today raise several questions about the timeline of events. This court would like to understand why preparations for selling the property began almost immediately after the authorization document was filed. Clara lifted her head slowly. The careful composure she had maintained throughout the hearing seemed more fragile now. Your Honor, she said, we were only exploring possibilities. We believed the house might become too difficult for Mr. Bennett to manage in the future. Judge Brooks looked at her steadily. Yet the property taxes were prepaid for 2 years and no financial obligations were overdue. Clara hesitated before answering. We were trying to plan ahead. Daniel Carter stepped forward slightly, attempting to support the explanation. Your Honor, he said, families often prepare for future changes. My clients believed it was responsible to consider options. I stood quietly beside the table, listening. The worn leather folder rested under my hand again, and I could feel the attention of the entire room focusing on it once more. Judge Brooks turned toward me. "Mrs. Whitmore," she said, "you indicated earlier that Mr. Bennett came to the courthouse seeking help understanding the documents he signed. Can you explain what happened when you first spoke with him?" I nodded slowly. "Yes, Your Honor." The room remained completely still as I spoke. Mr. Bennett approached the records office with the letter he received in the mail. He believed the document he had signed was related to paying bills. When he read the letter confirming administrative authority over the property, he realized something was wrong. I paused briefly, remembering that morning clearly. He asked if there was a way to obtain copies of the filed documents. I showed him where to request them. Judge Brooks listened carefully. "And what happened after that?" "When he received the copies," I continued, "he asked if I could help him read through the language. The document contained legal terminology he did not fully understand." Daniel Carter crossed his arms slightly as he listened. Clara remained very still. I continued speaking calmly. "That is when we noticed the section granting authority to sell the property immediately if the administrators considered it necessary." A quiet murmur moved through the spectators again. Judge Brooks looked toward Clara Bennett once more. "Mrs. Bennett," she said, "did you discuss that clause with Mr. Bennett before he signed the document?" Clara did not answer immediately. The pause stretched across the room again. Finally she said, "We believed it was implied in the overall authority to manage the property." Judge Brooks studied her for a long moment before responding. Implied authority and explicit authority are not the same thing. The words carried a calm firmness that seemed to settle heavily in the courtroom. Daniel Carter opened his mouth slightly as if to speak again, but the judge raised her hand gently before he could interrupt. "This court is not questioning whether family members may assist one another," she continued. "What concerns the court is whether Mr. Bennett understood the full scope of the document he signed." Harold Bennett sat quietly beside me, his hands folded again as he listened. The faint lines on his face seemed deeper now, but his expression remained calm. I opened the folder one more time and removed the final document inside. It was a small sheet printed with a familiar seal near the top. I walked forward and placed it beside the other papers on the bench. Judge Brooks examined it carefully. After a few seconds her expression changed again, this time with unmistakable recognition. "This appears to be a record from the county registrar," she said. I nodded. "Yes, Your Honor. It confirms that the authorization document was filed less than 24 hours after Mr. Bennett signed it." The courtroom absorbed the information slowly. Daniel Carter looked toward Clara again, but she did not return his glance. Judge Brooks leaned back slightly in her chair and folded her hands together. The pieces of the story now rested quietly on the bench in front of her, each document forming part of a timeline that was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. For several long seconds the courtroom remained completely silent. The laughter that once filled the room had vanished entirely, replaced by a quiet realization spreading across every face present. The janitor who had walked into the courtroom beside an old man had not simply asked questions. She had patiently revealed a sequence of facts that none of the spectators had expected to hear when the hearing began that morning. The courtroom remained completely silent as Judge Eleanor Brooks studied the final document resting on the bench. The timeline was now clear in a way it had not been when the hearing began that morning. Each piece of paper told part of the same story, and together they formed something impossible to ignore. The authorization document had been prepared before any real financial concern existed. It had been presented to Harold Bennett with only a partial explanation. It had been filed with the county office less than 24 hours after he signed it. And within 4 days a real estate firm had already begun preparing to place the property on the market. Judge Brooks leaned back slightly in her chair and folded her hands together. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the calm authority of someone who had spent decades weighing facts against explanations. "This court appreciates the patience shown by all parties involved," she said. "However, The evidence presented today raises serious concerns about whether Mr. Bennett fully understood the document he was asked to sign. No one in the courtroom moved. Even the spectators seemed to understand that the moment everyone had been waiting for had arrived. Judge Brooks turned her attention toward Clara Bennett. "Mrs. Bennett," she continued, "you testified that the purpose of the document was to help manage your father-in-law's responsibilities. Yet the language within the document allowed immediate authority over the property itself, including the ability to sell it." Clara sat still in her chair, her expression controlled but strained. Daniel Carter stood beside her with his hands clasped together, his earlier confidence now replaced by careful restraint. Judge Brooks continued speaking. "The court must determine whether Mr. Bennett knowingly granted that authority." She turned her gaze toward Harold Bennett for a moment. The old man remained seated beside me, his posture quiet and steady. Judge Brooks looked back toward the documents again. "Based on the testimony and the records presented today, this court finds that Mr. Bennett did not receive a clear explanation of the full scope of the authorization document before signing it." A soft wave of murmurs moved across the courtroom benches. Judge Brooks raised one hand slightly and the room settled again. "Therefore," she continued, "the court rules that the authorization document filed on February 15 is invalid." The words landed with quiet finality. Clara Bennett lowered her eyes. Daniel Carter exhaled slowly but said nothing. Judge Brooks continued in the same calm voice. "Administrative authority over the property shall immediately revert to Mr. Harold Bennett." Harold did not react dramatically. He simply nodded once as though the decision confirmed something he had quietly believed all along. Judge Brooks then looked toward the rest of the room. "Furthermore," she added, "the court strongly advises that any future legal documents involving property or financial authority be explained to Mr. Bennett in full detail with independent counsel present." The statement carried a firm but measured tone, not accusatory but unmistakably clear. Daniel Carter nodded respectfully. Clara Bennett remained silent. For several seconds the courtroom remained still. The long morning of testimony, documents, and questions had finally reached its conclusion. Judge Brooks gathered the papers on the bench and placed them neatly into a small stack before speaking again. "This hearing is concluded." The sound of the gavel tapping lightly against the wooden block echoed through the room. It was not loud, but it carried the unmistakable signal that the case was finished. People began to shift in their seats. Some whispered quietly to one another. Others looked toward Harold Bennett with expressions that had changed completely since the morning began. When I had first stepped into that courtroom beside him, many of them had laughed. A janitor standing at the defense table had seemed ridiculous. Now those same faces watched with something closer to respect. Harold turned toward me slowly. For a moment he did not speak. Then he smiled in the quiet, grateful way of someone who had just watched a long misunderstanding come to an end. "Thank you," he said softly. I shook my head slightly. "You only needed someone to read the papers carefully," I replied. Across the room Daniel Carter spoke quietly with Clara Bennett while gathering their documents. The tension that had surrounded them earlier had softened into a quiet acceptance that the case had not unfolded the way they expected. One by one the spectators began leaving the benches, still discussing what they had witnessed. The story would likely travel through the courthouse corridors before the afternoon was over. People would talk about the unusual hearing where a janitor had stood beside an old man and calmly questioned every detail until the truth became impossible to overlook. Harold Bennett slowly stood from his chair and adjusted his coat. The afternoon sunlight filtering through the tall courthouse windows stretched across the floor in long pale lines. As we walked toward the door together, the same hallway waited outside where I pushed my cleaning cart every evening after the building closed. For most people inside that courthouse, it was just another workday coming to an end. But for Harold Bennett, the house where he had spent 42 years of his life was still his home. And as we stepped through the doorway and the courtroom doors closed quietly behind us, no one in the room was laughing anymore.